The Monster Hunter series has an interesting history with bugs. You had the Vespoids in the first game, who were annoying pests that could paralyze you, the Vespoid Queen in Freedom Unite, as well as the Nahabra and Alteroths from Tri onwards. But Monster Hunter 4 introduced an even bigger bug, the Seltas. The Seltas is a Neopteron encountered early in the game. He is dark green with a giant horn and 2 big claws. He is capable of flight and can hover around. Seltas is not the first large monster bug, as the Vespoid Queen was also pretty large, but she was fairly basic and was mostly just a glorified Easter egg. Seltas is far more developed in comparison. He can be encountered in forests, jungles and mountain regions. In terms of battle, he stays in the air and fires corrosive globs from a stinger that inflicts defense down. He can strike with his claws and spin around too, but his signature move is the charge, where he readies himself and zooms at a high speed towards you, aiming to pierce you with his giant horn. When enraged, he can double it up, and while the attack can be tricky to deal with for a beginner, it can be exploited by standing in front of a wall. At the right angle, Seltas will fly straight into it and get stuck for a while, allowing for free damage. Hurting him enough will have him fall to the ground, and from here he'll walk around and strike with his claws. Eventually, he'll fly back up into the air. The Seltas is a beginner monster, and in 4 is a lot of people's introduction to a flyer. This can make him potentially difficult. For example, when I first faced him, I was using dual swords, and I really struggled with the limited reach of the weapon. I even abandoned the quest and came back with Charge Blade. However, once you come to terms with this very limited moveset, you'll find him to be very exploitable. He spends large amounts of time hovering in the air not doing anything, and all his attacks are very easy to see coming. This is even more the case when he's on the ground. His rate of attack is very low, and because half of his head is his body, impact weapons have a very easy time keeping him stunned. He becomes a very cool punching bag later, and it's fun to break his horn. Seltas' status as a beginner monster is further emphasized by the battle music, which he shares with other beginner monsters. He also has craftable weapons, but curiously no armour except for the waist. Considering that every other large monster allows you to craft a full set, this is kind of an interface spoiler. Something else needs to be killed in order to unlock it. Later on, you meet that someone. You see, all Seltases are male. The female is known as the Seltas Queen, and she is significantly different. While the Seltas is a nimble drone, the Queen is a hulking tank. She's massive, being substantially larger than the male. She cannot fly, and instead walks with 4 giant legs. Her front claws are not so big and therefore can't be used for attack, but they do protect her face and can be used to dig, which is how she moves between areas. She also has a massive tail with a pincer. The Seltas Queen is a lot slower in how she fights, and a lot of attacks have her leverage her size. She can shift her whole body in a hip check, charge at you, and swing her tail. She can also aim it above her head and jab towards you. She hits hard, but she's quite slow. She does not have a unique battle theme, but the music for the Heavens Mounts locale is associated with her. The Seltas Queen is almost always accompanied by a Seltas. He will often hang out in the same area and attack you independently, but soon enough, the Seltas Queen will release pheromones from her body that attract Seltas towards her. He sits on her back, and the pheromones enhance his physical attributes. His claws dramatically extend, granting them extra range, and his corrosive fluid now instead drains stamina. In this mode, the two work together and function like a tank. The Seltas Queen can move around and do her regular attacks, while the Seltas fires those acid globs and strikes with his extended claws, being able to turn 360 degrees. Her Highness also has enhanced mobility thanks to the Seltas, as she moves much faster and gains the ability to turn around instantly. While the two operate independently, they are also capable of combined attacks. The Seltas can lift up the Queen and either drop her down on you or do an aerial charge. The Queen can drive the smaller Seltas' horn into the ground and charge up to 3 times in a row. Seltas can even lift her out of pitfall traps, although not shocks, but he is not affected by them while on her back and can still attack while she's paralysed. Seltas Queen's strongest attack has her charge up 3 massive water globs over time, before releasing them. They do significant amounts of damage, but can be prevented with enough damage to the head. When Seltas Queen summons Seltas, sometimes she will let him sit down at his own pace, but on other occasions, she will forcibly grab him and bring him down to speed things up. Seltas can be knocked off the Queen by dealing enough damage to either of them, or performing a mount, and for a while they'll operate independently again, meaning you have to divide your attention between 2 different targets. This is the perfect opportunity for you to focus on Seltas and kill him, which makes the fights much easier. But you might not have to bother. Seltas Queen can become exhausted, and when this happens, like most monsters, she will eat to regain stamina. This can either be a monster corpse on the floor, or Seltas. She uses her tail pincer to grab, and smash him against the ground 3 times, killing him. She then proceeds to eat him. You can actually carve Seltas because he's literally dead, and will stay that way until his body expires, wherein a new Seltas will eventually spawn. Every Seltas Queen quest will have the Seltas listed as a monster that will show up. In fact, most of the time, killing Seltas in these quests will be entirely optional. You only have to kill the Queen, leaving the smaller Seltas around to harass you while you carve. Prior to World, Monster Hunter games had a limit on how many large monsters could be active at once, with a cap of 2 for normal monsters and 1 for most Elder Dragons. Seltas Queen can be in quests with other monsters, but will always appear independently in order to save a slot for Seltas, so that she can work with him, and a replacement can appear upon his death. This means it's impossible to be invaded during Seltas Queen hunts, and they will both show up when other monsters are dead. Even though Seltas Queen can keep summoning Seltases, they're not that hard to kill on their own, as they have drastically less health than the Queen, and although she can summon more, she has to wait for the body to expire first, which severely limits her potential and gives you an easier time killing her. Her subspecies solves this problem. 4 Ultimate introduces the G-Rank exclusive Desert Seltas and Desert Seltas Queen. As their name and colour implies, they can be found in the dunes, although the male is first encountered in the Ancestral Steppe. The main differences are that Desert Seltas has different horns, now resembling a stag beetle, and the Queen has much bigger tail pincers. Generally, subspecies are different colours to the base monsters, but it's highly uncommon for them to have such physical differences like this. Desert Seltas fires paralysis globs rather than defense down. His horns are different because they're optimised for burrowing, which is how he travels between areas. The Desert Seltas Queen is much more violent towards her male partner. She will not actually release pheromones to attract the Desert Seltas, and will instead pull him out of the ground onto her back. This is likely why her pincer is so much longer, as it is optimised for this purpose. It also makes attacks with it have a much wider reach. She doesn't exactly do the horn charge, likely because the Desert Seltas' horns are not optimised for that purpose, but she can do a mini charge with an upswing. The Desert Seltas Queen will still fire the water globs as the base form would, but she can also load the Desert Seltas into the attack and fire him like a cannonball. This attack blasts him at you with enough force to shatter his whole body to pieces, instantly killing him and leaving you with nothing to carve. Because there is no body, the second monster slot is immediately freed up, allowing the Queen to dig another Desert Seltas from the ground to use in battle. She can also do this attack as part of a pin. This is a really clever change that covers up a substantial weakness of the original fight, but it also highlights the difference between the standard Seltas Queen and the desert kind. The Seltas Queen sometimes gets impatient with Seltas. Her killing and eating him is violent, yes, cruel perhaps, but she does it out of necessity, and he lives for this purpose. Either we kill him, or she gets nourishment, so the choice is obvious, and they work together in every other aspect. But the Desert Seltas Queen clearly views her male companion as useless, dispensable even. It's highlighted in the way she doesn't even wait for him to show up for the fight, violently digging him out of the ground, and how she happily sacrifices him not even for food, but the chance to destroy her enemies. The fact that she has clearly evolved her tail for this purpose makes it even crazier. Earlier I compared the combined force of the Seltas and Queen to a tank. Their armours are designed to almost look like robots, mostly on the male side though, as the female set has the face and arms exposed, which makes her look more like a human wearing a robot suit. Many people have compared the sets to the mecha suits from anime like Gundam or Gurren Lagann. The male sets have a lot of bulk and are decorated with Seltas Queen tail pincers that end up serving as horns and shoulder spikes. The armour is good for mechanical weapons too, particularly the charge blade and gun lance, as it has the skill artillery, which boosts impact fire and shelling damage. The weapons are quite interesting. While the armour can only be crafted once you've defeated the Queen, only the regular male Seltas is required to craft the weapons. Many of their design elements feature Seltas parts. They have his colours, claws, and his signature horn worked into them in some way. For example, you can see his horn on the sword of the charge blade, and the shield features his claws for the axe mode. The gun lance is the opposite, as it features his claws on the lance and his horn on the shield. When I played 4 Ultimate, I was particularly fond of the dual swords and hammer, because they're literal drills. The dual swords are essentially worn rather than held, and are constantly spinning, while the hammer is rocket powered with every attack. This was long before Valstrax's weapons or World's Wyvern ignition. Now here's something cooler. When you defeat the Seltas Queen, you get to upgrade the weapons, and the designs actually evolve. They become bigger and more developed, with a darker shade of green, with white incorporated into the design, to resemble the Seltas Queen's back. Not just that, but her physical attributes are also seen in the weapons, as her tail pincers entirely replace what used to be Seltas' claws. Compare the bows for instance. Look how different the second one looks with the Seltas Queen parts. I also really need to highlight the weapon names too, they're fantastic. The Seltas hammer is called the Accelerated Hammer, while the Seltas Queen's is called the Overclocker. The Seltas Gun Lance is Monsieur Gore, while the Queen's is Madame Butcher. The Seltas Insect Glaive is the Sect Hopper, while the Queen's is the Cannibal Hopper. The descriptions of the low and high rank sets describe how they were made and what they do. The G rank descriptions are more interesting. Not only are they described as being more technologically advanced, which is no surprise given their appearance, but they're also described as embodying and pursuing justice, with a call to suit up and go forth. The Desert Seltas armor on the other hand goes further beyond, describing the armor as having high speed, potentially being capable of flight, and having powerful weapons. Not to mention a different call to go forth, Golden Deliverer. Of course, this further emphasises the mecha anime references, as those suits are often capable of flight and outfitted with all different kinds of weapons. There are certainly interesting references to make for the Seltas couple. I compared the Seltas Queen to a tank earlier, and considering she walks on legs rather than treads, that would make her more comparable to a mecha. So in that context, Seltas would be the pilot, which, obviously isn't the case. So that kind of makes the whole thing a very funny inversion, even more so for the Desert Seltas Queen. The Palico armor looks very much like a cartoon robot, and a miniature lance resembling a drill can be used by them. Seltas weapons all deal water element damage, and in full ultimate have an innate defense boost just for using them. Seltas and his queen were designed by veteran Capcom illustrator Shinya Idaki, also known as Idayan. He wanted a fight that could make use of both monster slots, and eventually came up with the idea of having different insects that could work together to become an entirely different fight on their own. After many drafts, he came up with the Seltas couple. Early concepts for the Seltas and his queen depict something very different to what we see in the final game. The early Seltas itself had a round body, with no giant claws and no horn. He did however have a very long tail with a pincer. He was described to have a very limited moveset, and could not fly. The designers depicted him hunting by hiding in the ground, and he would use his pincers to snatch up prey that walked above him. The Seltas Queen was also very different. She was depicted as essentially a giant spider, by Monster Hunter standards anyway. 4 legs, 2 claws and a fat body. She was still capable of placing Seltas on her back, and would do so during breeding season by digging him out of the ground. Her back was described to have anti-slip protrusions, so the male Seltas could hold on with ease. While the Seltas was depicted as not being very capable and had to hunt by ambushing prey from below, the Queen could actively hunt on her own above ground, and when together, the male Seltas essentially got to eat the leftovers the Queen would leave behind. He would serve as an energy tank of sorts for her, so she would actively try to feed him from time to time, as it mutually benefited the both of them. Individually, the two monsters look very different to how they are in the final game, but together, a familiar silhouette forms. It becomes apparent that combined, the two monsters would have been quite similar to what we have now. This time with the male Seltas having the tail, and the Queen having the giant claws. But I suppose this would have made the male Seltas rather useless. He wouldn't get to do a whole lot on her back, and on his own would not serve as much of a challenge at all. Idayan seems to have revised Seltas to be more capable, having flight, a giant horn and the claws. The Seltas Queen got the tail in the divorce, but her claws were shrunk down and her entire body structure was changed, which does nicely set her apart from Nasyla. The end result is that Seltas is somewhat formidable on his own, and ends up providing a lot to the Queen in combat. Because he can turn 360 degrees on her back, he can attack in all directions, which would not have been possible in the initial concepts. This does make the Queen slightly less capable, but she's rarely encountered without Seltas, and is now far more dangerous with him, so it works out pretty well. It also seems like the idea of the Queen digging Seltas from the ground was brought back for the Desert Seltas Queen, which also works really well to set her apart. There's also another early Seltas Queen concept that shows her to be more insect-like, as she has fly wings that let her travel short distances while in the air. She seemingly would have lost this ability once Seltas was on her back, but if Seltas died, either by your hand or hers, it would boost her strength. This aspect would have been interesting to see play out in the full fight. While we're at it, I think this is a good opportunity to discuss the localization. Why are they called Seltas for us English players? The lead of Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate's localization team, Andrew Alfonso, published some really insightful blogs talking about the process of naming many of the game's monsters. I'll link all the blogs in the description for you to read for yourself. Seltas in Japan is called R. Seltas. The Queen is called Janelle Seltas. As you can hear, the word Seltas is already in both, but the other words have connotations with the military. The Queen is like a general or a commander, while the Seltas is a basic soldier. Alfonso and his team came up with Scarius, which is derived from Scorpion and Sagittarius. The former because of the Seltas Queen's pincer tail, and the latter because Seltas' projectiles make him something of an archer. They also came up with Scarith, which derives from Scorpion and Scarab. The Ath part comes from how many monsters in the series are named: Rathalos, Anjanath, Baroth. For Her Majesty, Alfonso and co. came up with several different titles relating to her status: Queen, Regent, Rhea, Duchess. The localization process would have Alfonso and his team come up with English words that carry over the meaning of the Japanese, and then approach the game's director with their suggestions to see if they approved. In this case, Monster Hunter 4's director Konami Fujioka liked the Queen title due to its simplicity, but he and art director Yuya Takuda suggested going with the Japanese name for the base. Seltas is relatively easy to say, and it sounded bug-like, so everyone agreed, and that's how we got here. Subspecies are not named in Japan, so the localizers have to come up with something brand new. In the case of the Seltas subspecies, the number one concern for Alfonso and his team was space. There was a limit on the amount of characters they could use, and because Seltas Queen is kind of long, they had limited options, which has been a problem in the past. So they came up with some name pairings: Seltas Reaper and Seltas Dread Queen, Blitz Seltas and Panzer Seltas Queen, Spartan Seltas and Amazon Seltas Queen. Alfonso and his team really liked Reaper and Dread Queen as they thought they were dark and powerful. Dread Queen in particular evokes the powerful dreadnought warships from the early 1900s, which particularly excelled at long-range attacks, similar to the subspecies of Seltas. However, Fujioka was not a fan because they sounded too dark. He said they fit Gore Magala and Nasyla, but not Seltas. So Alfonso and his crew instead decided to base the name on the colours and habitat of the subspecies, eventually settling on desert. The Hunter's Choice poll for the 20th anniversary gave us an idea of how popular the Seltas gang are in comparison with every other monster in the series. The Seltas Queen is the highest, ranked at 104th place, and in between Paolumu and Black Veil Valhazak. She's followed by Seltas at 172nd, who is in between Deviant's Rust Razor Cyanator and Drilltusk's Tetsukabra. The Desert Seltas Queen comes after, at 195th place, tying with my boy Gyrotodus and coming right ahead of Somnicanth. The Desert Seltas is joints last place with Steel Uragan, and is narrowly beaten out by Iodrome. Kind of abysmal for the Wasteland Warrior. Believe it or not, the Vespoid Queen, who I dismissed earlier as a glorified Easter egg, got 82nd place, beating out all the Seltases. I personally think the Seltas is a very good beginner monster, tricky to deal with at first but very exploitable once learnt. The Seltas Queen has a fantastic first impression, especially because she appears alongside Seltas, which really helps contrast the two of them. I like the idea of Seltas Queen in theory, a big hulking tank as opposed to a nimble drone, but her moveset is a little bit underbaked. Maybe this is by design, because the male Seltas does add a whole new dimension to the fight, and greatly expands the kind of things she can do. The way he operates independently from her, firing projectiles, striking physically, and even assisting her when she gets caught in traps. It was unlike anything we had ever seen before. The horn charging is visually such a destructive looking attack too, you can really feel the rage coming from it. Seltas being such a huge buff for the Queen ultimately means that killing him first is the best possible option, which does drastically nerf her abilities for a long period of time, and generally is not so hard to do. Which is why it's so funny that she can do it for us. Deliberately too. I believe this is the first time we can see a monster kill another monster in real-time gameplay. Kind of like a precursor to Turf Wars. It's such a fantastic part of them, because it's literally something that real-life insects can actually do, such as Black Widows. The Desert Seltas Queen takes this to a whole different level by treating the male Seltas as a disposable weapon. This conveniently patches up the Queen's biggest weakness and adds an element of brutality to the whole dynamic. The Desert Seltas Queen has a noticeably different fighting style, and I'm a big fan of the alternate design of the Desert Seltas. The stag beetle horns are really cool, and explain why he's better at living underground than the normal one. The prospect of a potential Seltas Queen return is interesting, because there's a lot of things they can do with her. Future games have monster caps that are higher than 2, so presumably Seltas, his queen, and at least one other monster would likely be able to roam around at the same time. That means there could potentially be turf wars. It would be really cool to see how the two of them fight monsters together. It seems like it would be really hard for a good chunk of the roster to be able to beat them. There could also be a possibility of more than one Seltas on the map. What if the two of them fought for the honour of being the queen's next meal, I mean guard? In terms of potential movesets, I think that while the Seltas is good, the queen needs to be more formidable on her own. I know that kind of defeats the purpose of the two of them combining forces, but she doesn't do a whole lot solo. Even just a couple more attacks and a slight speed increase would make her feel much more formidable. To be honest, I do think they would make her more like the Desert Seltas Queen and adjust the rate at which Seltas could respawn, which would fix the problem. In fact, if you had one Seltas Queen and a swarm of Seltases, there wouldn't be a problem at all. I wanted to discuss the Seltas and Queen because they're some of the most unique monsters in the series. The way they join up, the way they attack independently and together, the trap interactions, and even the cannibalism. Not to mention the Desert Duo taking that dynamic to the next level. I wanted to highlight their gear and their designs. They're fantastic monsters and more people should know about them. I hope they return someday. Thank you for watching this video. This is the first of a series where I discuss monsters that I find really interesting, and I'm looking forward to sharing future episodes with you all. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.